I also think sometimes we approach these conversations from a very defensive posture because we think that, oh, it's bad to say no. So as soon as I say no or set a limit, I then have to explain my limit and I have to make sure to explain it in a way that it will be accepted. Um, and that's not really the case because at the end of the day, I can just say no or no, thank you with a smile.
Welcome to the art and science of difficult conversations, where we believe when you communicate better, you live better. As always, I'm Chris. I'm one of your hosts, and I'm joined by Lucie. Lucie, Happy New Year. This is our first recording of the new year. How are you?
I'm pretty good, Chris. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. I'm recovering from a cold, and I
Mm,
did a
I
polar
can hear
plunge
it.
yesterday to celebrate the new year.
Oh, wow. That's something different. How was it?
Cold. It was cold. It was
I
cold.
bet.
But how was your holiday?
It went very fast by. I cannot believe this. Few days, but it was beautiful. I really took some time off just to recharge and go for a walk by the beach. So I'm really grateful. Was, the not the traditional Christmas with snow.
Yes.
Yet I still enjoyed it. How was yours?
It was good. It was good. We got to have a little bit of snow. It was a lot of
Hmm.
freezing temperatures for a little bit, and then over the weekend we were at my in-laws, and it was just rain, just heavy rain
Ooh,
all weekend. It was
wow.
wild. But here we are today. We're starting the year off right, talking about difficult conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I don't know about everybody here, but I think this is the topic today is something that I think we see a lot in terms of difficult conversations and relationships. I see it a lot in different Reddit forums, in personal relationships. We've even had a couple episodes about it. How do we set better boundaries with either family members who are overstepping their bounds, with friends, at work, all these kind of things. So it's nice for us to actually get an expert today that's more qualified to speak about it than us. Because even though I'm a therapist and I do this a little bit, I love hearing other people's perspectives and how they're helping other people do it as well. So today we have a mindset coach who's really helping a lot of busy women and men kind of set better boundaries for themselves and their time. And so I'm going to introduce her and let her introduce herself. Becky, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Yeah, tell the listeners all about yourself. How did you get here? Who are you? What's going on with your life?
Oh, that's a big question. I might have a few minutes on that. So I am Becky Upchurch, and I say that I'm a clarity and mindset coach because I think those things go together. And right now, my work is really focused on boundaries and how we can understand what boundaries are and set healthy boundaries with other people. And I think the way that I kind of came to this work, a couple of years ago, I had an aha moment where I guess it was the end of 2022, beginning of no, end of 2023. We're in 2025 now. I was on a call or listening to a call with one of my then coaches, and it was around kind of, your focus in your business and thinking about the things that you do well. And somebody said something, and I had this light bulb moment where I was like, oh, wait, people really struggle with boundaries and saying no and not being people pleasers. And that's something I'm really good at. Like, I've never really thought about that. I've never really explored that. And so it kind of led to this exploration, and then it's become my passion. But one thing I realized in that exploration is the reason that I think I'm so passionate about this is because I see how it can impact your life as somebody who was not always good with boundaries and somebody who was not always able to not be a people pleaser. So having kind of that before and after experience and realizing that it in fact will not kill you to set a boundary, it will not destroy your life to say no to somebody you love. And I think so many of us live in a world where we feel like we don't have the space to say no, or when we do try to say no, we end up feeling bad about it and we end up beating ourselves up. So that's kind of how I got into this specific niche of my work. In terms of how I came to coaching, I actually worked as a teacher. I was a classroom teacher. I left the classroom to become an instructional coach, which is work that I still do, I still love. But as I went through coach training, I realized kind of how vast the possibilities were for the use of coaching and how it can change not just people's work in academia, but people's work in general, people's lives. And so that's when I enrolled in an ICF accredited coach training program and did my coursework there, and started my company, and it just kind of went from there. And now I just feel like I can't get enough of learning more about how people think and how their minds work and how they show up in the world, and how to hopefully impact them in a positive way so that they can create the change they want to see.
I love that zigzag career path. I feel like that's very common for Lucy and I, and a lot of our guests
Yep.
have that zigzag career path for sure. So when you said that you grew up not being great at boundaries, like what did you notice about not being good at boundaries, or when did you finally notice that there was a kind of an issue there?
So I think I'll be honest, growing up, I always kind of felt like a black sheep in my family. I do feel like I come from, I am the youngest of 5 children, and I feel like I've got, some high achievers in there. And as anybody who is a youngest child has probably experienced, you go through school and you hear the question like, oh, are you so and so sister, or are you as smart as so and so, or and there's a lot of comparison. I think sometimes people don't realize how much they compare people within families. And so I think a lot of it for me was this driving force of wanting to be just as good as my siblings, wanting to please my parents, wanting to make them happy. And then I think a lot of us were kind of taught, you mentioned earlier that zigzag career pattern. And I think that sometimes at the root of that is we grow up being taught certain things about what it means to make a good life and what a good job looks like and what a career should be. And then as we get older, I think sometimes some of us start to question those teachings, especially as the world has shifted. The world that existed in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s that a lot of us grew up in is not the same world we live in. So it makes sense that options are different, pathways are different. But I think a lot of us kind of started in a pathway that we didn't really design for ourselves. We kind of stepped into a pathway that other people designed for us. And so as we get older, I think it makes sense to explore more things. And I think that's kind of what happened to me. There were a couple of pieces to it. The first was when I was approaching my 40th birthday, I think I had some things happening in my life that created some natural shifts. And I really started thinking a lot about my career path. And that was kind of the point in time when I started my business. But even before that, I really started thinking about what it means to like create a life, and evaluating the path I was on. And the kind of short version of the story is, again, I was on that high achiever path. I was, an educator. I decided I was going to go into leadership. So I already had gotten a master's in education. I went back, started another master's program in education leadership. And it was like, oh, I'm going to move up the ranks and be a school principal and do all the things. And I had lost a close friend of mine kind of during that time. And I had this moment of realization that I had not been spending a lot of time with that person. Like we had been very close, and then our lives kind of changed and shifted and we grew apart, as happens. But there was some reflection with that, thinking about, missed opportunities and, what if I had done XYZ? And with so many lessons that, God, life, the universe, whatever you believe in, tries to teach us, I didn't quite internalize the message. And I kind of kept on that track, and I kept plugging away, and I, was doing all these things and going into all of these leadership roles, and doing all of these things to get to that, magical endpoint. And then I had another one of my friends pass away. And that was kind of a moment for me to really say, okay, I heard the message. And I went into my boss and I basically said, I'm going to keep doing my job. I'm going to do my job well. But all of these extra things that I've been doing, I just have to let them go. And, to her credit, she could not have been more lovely and wonderful and gracious. And to this day, she's still one of my dearest friends. I just appreciate her so much. So it was kind of that aha moment of really starting to examine my pathway. So I ended up
Mm.
I got the leadership program under my belt, but I ended up not becoming a school administrator, which I'm very grateful for because I realized it was not a job well suited for me. But that kind of opened the door to really exploring some of the later things with, oh, now I might want to change, my focus of what I'm doing as a coach, and really just opening doors to so many other things. And I think that that's a story that a lot of people probably share, where things happen in your life that just kind of they spark that little, well, wait a minute. And then you start to question and you start to look and you start to explore.
Did that spark, how did that impact how you went into that conversation with your boss, saying you're not going to take on those extra things? Because I feel like for some people, it could be a nerve-wracking experience, but also if you've got that spark, you might go in there totally confident and like ready to lay it all down.
So I was actually surprisingly calm about it in hindsight. And I remember um, because it was something where I kind of had my hands in all different things that we were doing. And I remember a friend and colleague telling me after the fact that she's like, I walked into a meeting and I looked around and I realized that you weren't there. And I said, is nobody else panicking about this? And it was kind of a funny story. And there was that moment of like, oh yeah, like, this will have an impact. But I think going in, I knew it was something I needed to do for me. And I think the headspace that I was in, I needed that space and I needed that time. And again, I think I was in a very unique situation that I had a boss who, I didn't know how she was going to react, but I knew she wasn't going to get angry. I knew it would be okay. And I remember her saying that to me, like, it's fine, like we'll be fine. And on the one hand, there's the ego piece of that I think sometimes we want our egos fed, that the world will end if we step away.
Mm.
But in this situation, it was very much a relief. There still was that little ego thing about like, oh, even I'm replaceable. But
Yeah.
because of where I kind of was in the headspace I was in at the time, it really was a blessing. And so I did feel like because I knew it was the right thing for me, I was able to go in and have that conversation and be
Mm.
calm and be clear. And that's why I think it's, one of the things that I talk about in my work is the importance of really knowing, like, what are your core values and what are the things that are meaningful to you? Because I feel
Mm.
like when you make decisions that are aligned to how you want to show up in the world for yourself and others, it's a lot easier to step into those conversations with confidence. I think when we kind of miss the mark sometimes, it's because maybe I'm going to say no to this thing because I think I should, or if I'm grounded in, well, I truly believe this is the right thing for me and for my people, I think it makes it a lot easier to show up a little bit
Mm.
more relaxed and balanced.
Mm-mm.
I really appreciate that. What are some of your activities that you love to do or prompts to get people to think about their values or hone in on their important values?
My absolute favorite core values, and she calls it core nutrients exercise that I have ever done, and I've done it multiple times over the years, comes from Tara Moore, who is
Mm.
trained as a coach. She's an author, and she authored the book Playing Big, and she does the Playing Big program and some various trainings around that. And the exercise that I learned from her that I love and I highly encourage anyone to do, she encourages you to think about peak experiences in your life. So to think back on what was an experience that you had where you felt, fully alive, like yourself. It just really, it's like you would think this is a peak experience. And think about like what qualities that experience had. So I'll give an example that one of the peak experiences that always comes to mind for me was years ago when I was working with a nonprofit. And we were coordinating this big event and just being a part of that, helping to coordinate, seeing the impact and all of these different things that went with that. And then you think of another peak experience, same thing. What was it about that experience? And then you look at what are the commonalities that I can tease out of this? What are the things that really made these peak experiences? And then are those, how are those things showing up in your life? So for example, for me, being in community is something that my peak experiences have in common. Providing value or helping to teach things to others is another core value of mine. So there, it's helps you to kind of tease out what are some of the values that show up in these peak experiences. It's like if all of these things I can name as the best moments of my life have these 4 or 5 things in common, well, what does that tell me? And then really using those 4 or 5 things to examine our life. So if I'm not feeling like, if I'm somebody where I'm like, oh, this has been the worst year of my life, really looking at it and saying, well, how did these 4 or 5 things show up in my life this year? Oh, 3 of them barely showed up at all. How do I integrate more of that into who I am and how I show up? And the thing that I really like about the way that she talks about this, and I find is very true with all things, I always say, keep it small, because when we make things too big, we don't do what we say we're going to do. It's like with goals, we do these huge things and then we fall off, or we try to change too much too fast. And it's the idea that we can integrate our values in small ways that have a huge impact. Like it doesn't have to be, oh, well, one of my core values is charity, so I have to quit my job and sell all of my things and, move to the ends of the earth to serve. No, it doesn't have to. I mean, it can be that if that's what you feel called to do, but it can simply be, hey, I'm going to volunteer once a month, or I'm going to be sure that I'm donating consistently because I have the means to do that. So it can really be up to us to decide what it looks like, but to really find ways to integrate those core values into our daily lived experience is, in my experience, the way we create kind of maximum joy, but also how we really get to know who we are and how we want to live. And then I think that extends into those conversations around boundaries and saying no. Because if I know what I want life to look like, if I know how I want to be present with myself and others, it's really easy to look at something and say, well, is that for me or is that not for me? And if it's not for me, I have some courage to say that, because I can, if I want to, articulate why it's not for me. Well, hey, that's really not going to work for me because one of my core values is to really protect my alone time. And, being on that week-long vacation with 27 other people is really kind of butting up against.
So it seems like your path to really identifying the boundary, the first step is self-reflection and just pausing and reflecting. What's really important in my life, and what's really important to me? What are my values? Now, what if somebody, their value is relationships? I want to have great relationships with others. And now somebody else wants something from them. And so they're thinking, well, this is my value. I want to be a kind person. And therefore, I should say yes, because otherwise it goes against my value of being a kind, good person that is caring about other people. What would you say to this person?
I absolutely love that question, because it is something that I love to talk about, because it is, I think, one of the absolute biggest misconceptions about boundaries. And you hit it on the head when you said, but I want to be a nice person. So when somebody asks me to do something, I want to say yes. And I think most people, and I know this is absolutely true for me and pretty much everybody I've ever met, so I tend to generalize when that many people have experienced it. But I think so many of us, if not all of us, are raised that the nice thing to do is to say yes. The good thing to do is to be agreeable. It's like there's good people and there's bad people. And good people help you out and they say yes, and they're always there for you. And while I think those things are admirable, I think sometimes what we get wrong is the idea that we then believe the converse is true. We believe that if I'm not always available, if I say no to you, if I set limits, that I'm a less good person or I'm a less kind person. And I like to use myself as an example. I think I am somebody who anybody who knows me well would say that I am extremely kind and loving. And yet I also think they would tell you that I have some of the strongest boundaries of probably anybody they know. So I feel like those two things do not have to be mutually exclusive. And I think sometimes we're not taught that. And so that's part of why people struggle so much with boundaries, is because we carry that mindset with us into our interactions with other people. And then we have this fear around, well, if relationships are my core value and I'm going to do this thing that's dangerous to relationship, then I'm in trouble. The
Mm.
other thing that I think is really important and way less talked about is how people pleasing impacts relationships. Because on the surface, it would appear that if you ask me to do something and you're my friend and I say yes to you, that's going to help our relationship. I would argue that that is actually not true. Because the reality is, if I say yes to you because I want to, then absolutely, that can help our connection. But if I say yes to you and I show up and I am secretly resentful or
Mm.
frustrated, whether I say anything or think I'm showing it or not, that's the energy I'm bringing to our connection. Also, I'm not showing up fully as my true self. And I believe 100% that the best way to build a connection with somebody is to be 100% authentically who you are, positive, negative, pretty, ugly, whatever it is. I just had this conversation with a friend the other day, and I said, to me, it comes down to, if we really want people to know us and love us, we have to let them see us. And so if I
Mm.
am showing up and I am showing up as my representative, I'm showing up as the friend I think I should be, I'm not really letting you see me. And that automatically creates a distance between us, whether it's acknowledged or not. I feel like that's felt. So if I do actually value relationships, the number one thing I'm going to do is show up as my authentic self. So I have friends who I love dearly and rarely see, and they know that I love them dearly. And it's just a matter of, um, I'm very introverted and I do very people-y work. I joke, I say I people all the time, and then I need my unpeople time. Unfortunately, that means some of the people I love the most see me the least. But I talk to, I have a friend I talk to almost every day. I call her my wise counsel. And I've mentioned her multiple times when I've done podcasts. I'm sure people are like, who is this person? But and it's funny, I joke around that, she recently moved further away from me and I was so sad about it. And then I said, you live 15 minutes away and I haven't seen you in person. I've seen you in person once over the last year. So I think it's also connections can be built in different ways. But again, to me, it goes back to being willing to really be open with somebody and saying no if it feels like a no, and trusting that if that
Mm.
person is really somebody who cares about you and wants to know and love and understand you, that it won't damage the relationship. It'll actually make it stronger, because that person will also know that when it's a yes, it's an absolute 100% yes, and it will make them feel valued
Mm.
and seen and appreciated.
How do you get to the point where you can say no without that fear or that guilt that's underlying?
Lots of practice. And I think that's one of the things that I really hope that, anybody listening to this understands. I think sometimes we think that, oh, if I want to make a change, I'm just going to make this change and then I'm going to, that's going to be it. I'm going to learn a phrase to say no. I'm going to use that phrase and it's all going to work out. I wish that were the case, but it isn't. At the end of the day, I feel like human brains are very complicated, and we have a lot of pathways in there that have been well worn over many years. And so those things don't just go away. So I think really focusing on the mindset work around, what are my beliefs? Why do I believe these things? Can I
Mm.
interrogate these beliefs? Is there something different there that I might want to believe? Can I build that belief? So that's kind of the homework in the background. Um, but I think also, again, just kind of leaning into that idea of relationship, that if you are somebody that I am in relationship with, and you are somebody that I want to continue to be in relationship with, trusting that having that conversation will actually yield better results and a better connection. I also think sometimes we approach these conversations from a very defensive posture. Um,
Mm.
because we think that, oh, it's bad to say no. So as soon as I say no or set a limit, I then have to explain my limit, and I have to make sure to explain it in a way that it will be accepted. Um, And that's not really the case, because at the end of the day, I can just say no or no thank you with a smile and leave it at that. Sometimes people feel a need to
Hmm.
provide an explanation. Certainly you can if you would like to. But I think, we tend to think of saying no as I have to have a caveat of why. I can't just say no because it's the choice I'm making for myself and for the situation. So I think also
Hmm.
learning that skill as well is really important. And then the final piece that I think makes it really hard, and that I think a lot of people don't think about on the front end, is I would argue it's actually really easy to say no and set a boundary. Where I think people struggle is with keeping a boundary, because people
Hmm.
say all the time, oh, no, I'm sorry, I can't. Or, oh, I'm not available to work late. Or, oh, no, I can't host that event. Or, no, I can't take off work to go to my kid's school to, be part of that party. And then when but I really need you. Oh, we're down three people. Oh, but you're the only person I can count on. It's very easy to backtrack. And I think
Hmm.
that's where a lot of us struggle, is with the holding of the boundary. So really practicing what that looks like, how to have those conversations if a conversation needs to be had, and really kind of modeling for people our expectations of engagement. That, my boundaries are not a negotiation for me. It's just simply, I'll give an example that's a little bit personal. Years ago, I created a boundary around something with my mother. And I always say to people, the first time you practice setting boundaries, don't pick somebody that you're close to. If you have a relationship with your parents, maybe don't pick them. um, and I just remember I was not going to attend something, and she said something to the effect of, well, I just feel like it's not going to feel the same without you, or it's not going to be the same without you. I think a lot of people hearing that from a parent, of course, there's that guilt. I felt it. I'm not human, right? And I also believed in my reason for not attending, and I was okay with it, and I had accepted it. So instead of immediately being like, okay, well, I'll try to make it work, it was really just simply a conversation of, well, I can't navigate your feelings for you, but this is the situation, and you're going to have to figure out what that
Hmm.
looks like for you. Um, and that may sound harsh as I explain it here, but I think that's also part of it, that sometimes we want to take responsibility for how other people choose to feel. And in a
Hmm.
lot of situations, people have other options that maybe they're not exploring because we're taking ownership for their experience.
I think that's a really powerful thought for our listeners to think about, is we don't have responsibility over how other people are going to experience something. We can't manage that. We can't own it. And not that we should purposely try to make people feel bad, but it's not our responsibility to how they react to things. I think that's really powerful, to distance yourself from that. Thanks for sharing that example.
And I'm also hearing not to start with the family members that there might be some deep long-term relationship with, and maybe difficult emotion connected with. Let's say if there's been a history of guilt tripping as a way
Mm.
to communicate, or whenever they try to set a boundary in the past, maybe they got a silent treatment, or an anger, or really some form of punishment for setting a boundary. So they get really trained, whenever I set a boundary, this is actually bad for me. So I rather don't set any boundary. What would you tell somebody like that, that they are like already aware? Okay, I think I'm really having a problem setting boundaries. What would be the first step, a small step they could start doing to get better at setting boundaries?
So the first thing I would ask them would be why. So, for example, if you are trying to set a boundary with a friend, and you're like, I don't know what it is, but every time this particular person asks for something, I just feel like it's impossible to say no. And so I would say to them, okay, well, let's imagine, okay, what's the last thing that person asked you to do? Let's imagine that. Let's imagine you say no and you set the boundary you wanted to set. What's going to happen? And then what's going on in your mind when that happens? Because what
Mm.
I think a lot of people don't realize is, what we are experiencing, what we're feeling, is all created by what's happening inside of our brain. So what are you thinking about that thing that's happening? And sometimes I'll give examples of a situation happening to two people, and it's identical situation, and they have a very, very divergent lived experience, because one person is having a thought that yields some positive action, some positive emotions, and the other person is having some really negative thoughts that lead to negative emotions and maybe negative actions or a lack of action. So really looking at, well, it's not the saying no that's causing you the discomfort. And it's not even that person's reaction that's causing you the discomfort. It's what you are making it mean. It's what you're making it mean about the relationship. It's what you're making it mean about you. So the first step is really identifying what that is, and then again, exploring it. If it's, oh my gosh, Lucie is mad at me now because I said no to her. Okay, well, is Lucie really mad at me? And if she is, what does that mean? Does that mean, oh, I'm thinking
Mhm.
Lucie is mad at me now and our friendship's going to be over and then I'm going to be alone and my inner narrative is kind of
Mm.
going down a rabbit hole. And I think a lot of times we do that without even realizing it. And I know I see this in my own life all the time. And I'll sometimes do a brain dump around something. It's like if I'm frustrated with something or I'm feeling anxious or I just am ruminating on something, I'll just write it on the top of a piece of paper and just bullet everything that comes to my brain. And usually the first few bullets are totally things I'm like, oh yeah, like I said no, like maybe Lucie at the top of the page. She's mad at me. I can't believe I said no to her. Oh, all surprising, all not surprising, all not surprising. And then eventually I'll hit on something that it's like, oh, I didn't realize that was rattling around in my brain. Maybe that's the thing I'm stuck on that I can't move past. So the first thing I would tell
Mm.
them is figure out why this is bothering you. Figure out what the root of the discomfort is. Because if we just try to say, okay, well, I'm just going to pick, I can give you phrases of things you can say, and I can give you ways to navigate conversation. But if you don't pair that with what's going inside your head, then next week we're going to have the same conversation. And the week after, we're going to have the same
Mm.
conversation because we're not actually creating change. It's like if you have an injury and you just keep like, oh, I'm just going to like keep rinsing it off. And it's like, no, you need stitches or maybe you need, some advanced medical care. Like we can't just keep, brushing off the problem. We really have to kind of go a little deeper to figure out the solution.
Becky, you are hitting on the exact framework of cognitive behavioral therapy right there. Right? The fact that our thoughts influence our feelings and influence our behaviors. And in cognitive behavioral therapy is really just focusing on how do we change those distorted thoughts or start challenging them ourselves. Because otherwise, you're right, we can give you the things to say or do, but you're going to keep getting into the same pattern and then end up in the same place eventually anyway.
And I love that you bring that up because I actually had a conversation recently because that's, a model in coaching that, people use and they call it different names, the model, the
Yeah.
results formula. I've heard all kinds of different things. And I was having a conversation with someone recently who I guess didn't realize the origins of that. And I said, well, it's not something that like some famous coach just made up. I said, it has its roots in, CBT. And like let's honor that because it's obviously something that is tried and true and is effective, but how many of us don't know that framework or don't know how to apply it in our lives? And so I think just helping people to have that awareness of like these feelings don't just come from anywhere and the things that you think aren't always facts, and it's okay to really explore and interrogate that.
When thinking and talking about when people are not aware of some things, let's say when somebody is not aware, when they haven't paused and reflected, oh, maybe I have a problem with a boundary. Probably they wouldn't listen to our podcast then, though, but still, maybe they are. They want to learn getting better at difficult conversations. If they're not aware they are having a problem with a boundary setting, what are some symptoms that could tell them maybe they do have a challenge with setting boundaries or keeping the boundary?
One of them, it sounds so silly, but it actually came to me one time when I was having a conversation with someone and they asked me, they said, well, describe to me what you feel when you realize like there's a boundary issue there. And I use this description, but I feel like it's very appropriate. It's like if you've ever seen a cat see something that it doesn't like or get scared and it goes into that posture and its hair expands and it's like that
Mm.
feeling. It's kind of like that. Like if I suddenly have that like my hair standing on end, like something's prickly, but maybe I don't know exactly what's going on. That to me is like a little buzzer that's like, ding, 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 like there's something here worth looking into. Is it something that's a boundary issue? Is it like, what's going on here? Another thing that I highly encourage people to look into is, how do you feel when you're engaging in certain things? Because I know from, again, my own experience, if I'm saying yes to something that I want to say no to, when I am in that experience, I am not excited to be there. I'm not feeling nurtured. I'm not feeling happy. I'm not feeling connected. Normally, what I'm feeling is I'm feeling disconnected. I'm feeling maybe resentful. Maybe I'm a little cranky. Those are all signs that maybe this isn't the right thing for me. And I feel like that's kind of a metric we can use for anything in life, right? Is how am I feeling in this situation? What emotions am I having? Because obviously, if I'm feeling terrible, I'm having some thoughts that are making me feel that way. So really just kind of paying close attention to our thinking, but also our bodies. Like if I'm sitting with a group of people and I'm feeling uncomfortable, if I'm feeling restricted, what is that telling me? If I've got a pit in my stomach, well, maybe there's something here that I really need to look at. And I think sometimes and I certainly have been guilty of this. I joke around. I told you in my intro, I did that like good student track for such a long time. And I think it really taught me to live in my head. And I think a lot of us are taught that, like, use your brain, be thoughtful, think things through. And I think what we are often not reminded of quite as much is that there is a lot of wisdom that lives inside of our bodies. And so learning to really tune into that wisdom as well, I think can help us kind of ascertain sometimes when something isn't meant for us or when something needs to shift.
I love that. I think it's absolutely right. And I always wonder, this is like a philosophical discussion I think about with myself, is how do you balance that with that feeling of uncomfortableness or it's not right for me when you're also engaged in a new experience that's ultimately going to change you for the better, like a new experience. And I guess, how do you balance those feelings? Because it could feel the same to people. It'll experience the same way.
Absolutely. I think, sometimes we forget that the emotions of excitement and terror can sometimes feel the same in our bodies. That's where I use that word interrogation with intention, because I think sometimes we have those feelings and we just say, oh, I'm feeling this way, it must mean that. Like, oh, I'm feeling uncomfortable, it must mean this is bad. Not necessarily. So really looking at, okay, well, why am I feeling uncomfortable? Well, maybe I'm feeling uncomfortable because I don't feel safe around these people. Okay, well, why don't I feel safe? Okay, that's maybe some actual danger versus, well, I'm feeling uncomfortable because I feel like everybody else is smarter than me. Okay, well, that's not actually dangerous, and that can be a really good thing, big picture. So really kind of questioning what I'm feeling, why I'm feeling it, and again, making that connection back to our core values. So if growth is a core value of mine, and I realize, oh, I'm freaked out because this is like a bigger thing than I've ever done. And it's really uncomfortable that I'm about to get up on a stage in front of a whole bunch of people, and I've never done that before. But if my core value is to grow, I need to sit in this discomfort. And oh, one of my core values is sharing knowledge. So this really speaks to that. Am I willing to sit in this discomfort? Because it's always a choice. We can choose to stay comfortable and not grow. And a lot of people do. And I think we've all been guilty of that in various stages of our lives. I mean, I know certainly I have, I think it's just the ebb and flow of being human, but really recognizing that we can make that conscious choice whether we want to kind of step back or step forward.
So it sounds like in that context, boundary is about protecting our values, protecting our life that we want to live. What do you think about setting boundaries with ourselves, not just other people?
That is a great question. And that's something I've actually thought a lot about in recent months. Because one thing that I think people, get wrong about boundaries is a lot of times they set boundaries around how they want other people to show up. And that's not a boundary, that's a barrier. And they're not the same thing. And I think that really understanding that we have no control how other people choose to live their lives, we can only choose how we live our lives, is kind of a key part of the process. And that includes maybe not focusing so much on trying to change other people and really focusing on ourselves. And I find boundaries with myself to be a really interesting part of the experience. One thing that I've had to kind of think about with myself is, a lot of times people think about, like, as they're making changes, as they're learning to say no to things, there may be things that show up not just with other people, but within ourselves. So if I start turning down social engagements because I'm setting boundaries around my time, because I'm working on a work project, or maybe I just am in a growth phase and need solitude, or whatever it might be, yes, there's how other people react, but then there may also be how I'm reacting to it internally. There might be that, oh, fear of missing out. It may be that, I'm judging myself for not showing up the way I used to. It
Mm,
might be, oh, but I say that I value connection, and here am I not leaning into that. What does that mean? And so again, really being able to release some of the expectations that we have for ourselves and how we show up. Um, but then also thinking about, like, I don't know about you guys, but I sometimes engage in behaviors that after the fact, I'm like, Becky, why do you do that? And
mm,
I like to think that's human nature. I don't think I'm a special snowflake in that way. I think that I am a human living a human life and a human experience. And so sometimes I look at some choices and I say, that's a pattern. And maybe I need to set a boundary with myself around that. Um, Again, as somebody who grew up as, an achiever, I think that there will always be an element of my existence where I feel the need to achieve or show my value. And just recognizing that even though there are so many different ways to show value, it can be easy to lean into those old patterns. And so sometimes setting that boundary around, well, how do I want to show up? How do I not? I joke around often when people, I'll ask people their best and worst qualities. And when people ask me that question, I always say loyalty. And they say, okay, so what's your worst
mm,
quality? And I say, oh, well, it's both. Because I think that I'm a very loyal person. In my past, sometimes that loyalty has gotten me in trouble because I have been
mm,
maybe too loyal to people who showed true colors that maybe weren't aligned. And I struggled to let go of relationships and connections because I felt this sense of loyalty and I wanted to
mm,
accept people how they are. Um, and I do still believe that's one of my superpowers, is being able to accept people for who they are, even when they show parts of themselves that maybe I don't like as much or they don't like as much. And learning to set that boundary with myself of, there's a difference between accepting someone for who they are and choosing to be in relationship with them, whatever that context is,
mm,
versus maybe realizing deep down inside in that, gut place and that value place, that, hey, we don't align in who we are as human beings, or maybe our journey is over and now is the time to release. So that's a boundary that I've had to work on and learn. And, I feel like I'm still learning, is to not cling to things that maybe have reached their natural conclusion out of a sense of loyalty or a sense of routine or comfort. And I think a lot of us sometimes do that. Sometimes you see people where it's like, oh, this is my friend so and so, and we've been friends for, 30 years. But then you're like, well, it seems like you don't really like so and so.
mm.
So just, giving ourselves the permission to say, hey, sometimes I'm the person I need to set a boundary with. Sometimes I need to say to myself, this is what is okay for me to do, and this is what maybe doesn't align so much with what feels good to me.
Two things. I think that what you just said there, you use the word choose the relationships. I think that's a really important nugget for people to think about, is we all have a choice in the relationships we have. Right. I think a lot of times we think every relationship is mandatory, that we are stuck with people for whatever reason, but we always have a choice in things. Right. And so it's our choice. We have to intentionally think about that. The second thing is, um, I heard a research a while ago that like the average length of a friendship is about 7 years. Have you ever heard that? And if not, does that make sense to you?
I have not heard that number, but that actually makes a ton of sense to me because I look at my own life and I look at who I am in this moment. And then when I think of the person I was 7 years ago and the person I was 7 years before that and 7 years before that, um, it really seems appropriate to me because I think, again, I have friends that I've had through many cycles of my life. But, I don't know if anybody here is a Swiftie, but, Taylor Swift talks about your eras.
Yep.
So I have, friends from different eras of my life who I'm still friends with. And I think that's in a lot of cases, it's because we have some shared values. And even if we haven't grown in similar ways, we have those connections and those pieces that hold us together. And then I have other friends that, we've grown apart or, we're not in each other's day-to-day lives, but we're still in each other's orbits. And then I have people in my life that, 7 years ago, I had a relationship with, and now I haven't spoke to in years. And not
Mm.
because anything bad happened, not because I wish them any ill will, but it was just, our convergence of paths worked when it worked. And then our paths seemed to diverge in different ways. And it just really didn't seem like it was a relationship that we were going to continue. And, sometimes I've had the experience where it's like, oh, I feel like I'm putting more in here. I'm going to take a step back and see what happens. And if you take a step back and the other person doesn't take a step forward, I think sometimes that's good information and you can, choose however you want to use that. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I kind of like that idea. And again, not that you have to, it's not like social media where you weed through your friends list and okay, who am I unfriending in the new year? But really being mindful of, just because you knew somebody at one point in time, doesn't mean you still know them.
Mm.
And then I have people who I knew, 20 years ago and they were one person. And here they are 20 years later and they're a different person and they're now back in my life in a different way, that actually feels aligned and good and positive. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting statistic. And I think that's also something really good for anybody who's listening to this, who's in relationship and thinks about, their relationship isn't what it once was. Because I think sometimes at the core of relationship issues can be people thinking, well, I signed up for this and now I am in that. And what does that mean? And again, you always have a choice. You always have a choice to leave. I am a firm believer of, I don't believe that people should stay in spaces where they are truly unhappy. And I think sometimes people are truly unhappy because they're not communicating what
Mm.
they need and what they value and what they're looking for. So I always encourage folks, if you're in one of those periods, hey, it's been 7 years, bye. No, hey, it's been 7 years and maybe something has shifted, but let's have a conversation around, hey, I've noticed in my own life, I'm seeing an increased need for XYZ. Is that something you're feeling too? What does that look like? And again, that can be, a romantic relationship, but even in a friendship, it might be, hey, we used to be like besties who hung out at the bar and I quit drinking and that's not something I want to
Right.
do. I'm really looking for more of this kind of connection. Is that something you're open to? If not, maybe you find somebody else to do those things and you still keep the relationship. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But yeah, I think as we kind of grow and change and the people around us grow and change, I think it's completely natural and appropriate to really evaluate those connections and those spaces that we are in with people and what fits and what doesn't.
I love that. I love the asking the question to turn the corner on the friendship and the new phase of her. I think that's something I would never have thought of before. I think that's a great question to just lay out what your new path looks like.
Mhm.
Becky, Lucy, let's imagine that some listener out there decided to skip the entire episode until this exact moment. If they miss the entire episode, Becky, what are 1 to 2 big takeaways that you hope that they would walk away with?
Well, I'm going to give them three because the first one is you should rewind and listen to everything else.
Yep.
But the
Yes,
other two
true.
would be number one, because I think a lot of people come to boundaries with the attitude of it's this difficult thing. And so the two biggest things that I would want them to take away is just realizing that identifying what boundaries you need to create, setting a boundary, and then that challenging piece of maintaining a boundary becomes a lot easier when you do two things. And one of those things is anchoring to your values and really knowing what those things are and how to live into them. And then number two is working on your mindset around saying no and boundaries and what that means. So that's kind of the first piece. And then the second piece, because I guarantee you that there is somebody listening who is thinking, well, this is you, Becky, and you sound like this is very easy and it's really hard for me, and you don't know how hard it is, and you don't understand how my mother is, or my cousin, or my coworker, or my whoever. And I would say, yes, and it's like anything. And I always like to, compare it to a muscle. You don't build a muscle without working on that. You don't go to the gym one time and suddenly you're, I don't even know who's like the super muscular person in this day and age, but it's like you don't go from 0 to 1,000. So like any muscle, boundaries are a process. And if you want to strengthen your ability to set and hold a boundary, you need to do two things. You need to train that muscle, and you need to have the training and the tools to help you make it happen. So those are kind of my two big takeaways that I would like people to remember.
Boundaries are a process. That is a quote. If I ever saw a
For
tagline,
sure.
if I ever saw
The boundary gym.
the boundary gym. Yeah. Becky, this has been a fantastic conversation. I feel like we can keep talking about this for a long time.
I know, this is so fun.
If people wanted to continue the conversation with you or just find your stuff, how can they find you? How can they follow you? How can they get in contact with you?
So the easiest way to get in touch with me is just probably directly via email, and that's Becky@highergoodcoaching.com, and it's higher with a GH. And then I'm on Instagram at Becky Upchurch _. My website is highergoodcoaching.com. So I feel like I'm fairly easy to find and I'm pretty responsive. So I always encourage folks to reach out. One of the things that I love about doing this work is the ability to serve people and to connect. And, I have what I call my life work motto, which is love, self, serve others, because I feel like those two things have to go together. You can't serve other people if you don't take care of yourself. But one of the things I love is hearing from people about what's helpful or maybe what they're dealing with. So even if you're like, I have no feedback on this episode, I don't need anything, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on X, shoot me an email, send me a message. I would love to connect.
Love that. Thank you so much. Lucy, any last parting words from you or thoughts?
I guess what I'm taking away is really this is a process. And it starts with self-reflection and pausing. So thank you, all of you that listened and paused with us. And kudos to you if you are also reflecting and taking this as an opportunity to reflect about your relationships, your relationship with others, family members, friends, coworkers, or even with yourself. And what would be at least one boundary maybe that you could set this week for yourself or today? Anything else, Chris, that you would like to add?
I love all of it. It reminds me a lot of when you were talking about your mom. I was thinking about a therapy client that I have that we've been working on setting boundaries with his mom. And part of the process is also thinking about grieving that relationship that he wishes he could have. Right. Which is more a therapy and not so much coaching. But I think that's also an aspect of it is when you're setting those boundaries, you are saying goodbye in a relationship. At least you're saying goodbye to the expectations of a relationship you wish you could have had, how you wish things could have gone. And that's part of the process sometimes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I would argue that sometimes what we are grieving, that we are losing, we are so caught up in what could be that we miss the beauty in what we can create.
Well, Becky, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.